We're just going to make a start now. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time zone you are in. Welcome to this event hosted by the PrOPEL Hub and Nottingham University, where we explore management and productivity issues, and the COVID-19 pandemic has presented fresh opportunities for us to rethink how we work. And my name is Cher Li. I am Associate Professor here in Nottingham University Business School. On behalf of the PrOPEL Hub and the Nottingham University local organizing team, I am extremely delighted today to welcome our panel of leading experts who have spent decades talking to business leaders and studying management practices, business performance, as well as informing industrial policy. It's fantastic to see many familiar faces here who have attended previous PrOPEL events. For those who join us for the first time, I wish to say a few words about the PrOPEL Hub. So first question, what does PrOPEL stands for? So this is for productivity outcomes of a workplace practice, engagement and learning. And PrOPEL is a major ESRC initiative that brings together researchers from 8 UK universities alongside the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. We're here to develop practical tips and tools to help businesses take advantage of the latest insights and expertise on what works. So you can find a wealth of information on the past events we have run on the PrOPEL website, and that is www.propelhub.org. And so today's event is an important part of the PrOPEL Hub's program. In the next hour, we're going to hear 4 presentations from our distinguished panelists who will reflect on trends in management and productivity to unpack the issues that matter to all businesses and highlight lessons on how to create a productive hybrid workplace as we build back after the pandemic. And so before I kick off with the first speaker, I'd like to emphasize that we are recording presentations and will make the recording available on our website, and the participants and Q&A discussions will, however, not be recorded. So to ensure a smooth and productive panel discussion, we'll not be taking any questions immediately after the presentation, but please feel free to post any questions or comments using the meeting chat that is located here at the bottom of your screen as we go along. And so our speakers will come back to your questions at the end of the session during our dedicated Q&A time. And there will also be opportunities to ask questions directly to our panelists during the Q&A session. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker today, Professor Paul Mizen. So I'm going to unshare my screen, and I'll let Paul put his slides deck on here. Paul is a professor of monitoring economics and the director of the Center for Finance Credit and Macroeconomics at Nottingham University. And Paul leads the work on decision maker panel in collaboration with Bank of England and Stanford University. So, okay, over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just confirm you can see my slides?
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I'm very delighted to be able to speak to the PrOPEL organisation today and the audience that are joining us. I'm going to speak briefly on the impact of COVID-19 on productivity, based on some work that I've done with Nick Bloom, who's on the call, and a number of researchers at the Bank of England and Nottingham University. And this is ESRC funded work. Okay, so the background to the productivity problem, if we look at the last decade in the UK and the US, we've seen really low productivity growth, averaging around about 1%, which is a real slowdown compared with previous decades. And with that very low starting level, the real worry for COVID is that if we've got even lower growth or even negative growth, then we're going to have lower living standards and strains on our public finances as a result of the COVID experience. So in this paper, what I'm going to do is just explore the impact of COVID on productivity, both in the UK and the US, but majoring on the UK, using data that we've gathered from two business surveys in the UK, the Decision Maker Panel and the Survey of Business Uncertainty, and then try and disentangle those effects and try and work out why is it that productivity has changed in the way that it has. And we're going to look at labour productivity, which is just simply output per hour worked, and total factor productivity, which is the amount of output produced by all the inputs, including capital, in the production process. And to give you the punchline, the net effect in the UK, total factor productivity fell by about 2 percentage points in the short term and is projected to fall by about 1% in the medium term. So this is going to bring about a further slowdown in productivity. So to set things in context, as probably most people know, the economic slump was the worst in 300 years. This was a Wall Street Journal headline in February of this year. And so compared to 3 centuries of data, we've experienced a really colossal shock. And the last time output fell by anything like this amount was back in 1706. So putting that into productivity space and thinking about how output has fallen relative to the amount of inputs, particularly hours, here's a couple of charts which show how output has fallen in the UK and the US using monthly data, and then comparing that against the hours worked. And what you see is both series have fallen by a large amount. The UK has had a steeper fall than the US and bounced back less quickly. And if you look at the far right-hand side, the graph shows that there's a real cycle in productivity. It jumps up, then it drops down, then it jumps up again. And so we have some gyrations in productivity, and we need to disentangle what's going on there. So what are the issues for productivity during COVID? Well, if you look at pure labour productivity, as the previous graphs have shown, output and employment both fell, but the hours fell by more than the output. So ironically, one of the things that we'll see in the productivity data is an increase in productivity per hour, suggesting there's been a mini productivity boom. But if we were to look at total factor productivity, we find that the use of capital has also fallen, the costs of producing output have increased, and then taking those into account leads to a calculation that shows total factor productivity falling. So on one measure, productivity is rising, on another measure, it's falling. To add to the complications, some sectors have done much better than others. Some have seen increases in output, not decreases, and not such drastic falls in labour hours. So we have to look at the whole picture and not look at the average across the UK. Also, furlough in the UK complicates matters because although people are employed, they've been on 0 hours and produced 0 output. So that makes it complicated to calculate the effect of productivity in terms of labour productivity or total factor productivity. And then on top of that, working from home, which I think Nick is going to talk about later, adds further to the complications, because it may be that some of the increase in output that we observe in some industries is down to the fact that individuals are more productive, or it might just be that they're actually working longer hours and we're not necessarily recording those hours. So to show you some of the diversity and the impact of COVID, here's a graph from the Decision Maker Panel, which shows the impact of sales by industry back in May 2020, which was probably the deepest hit, the largest hit on sales due to COVID. And what you can see here is that some sectors faced, particularly the highly consumer-facing services, were really badly hit. I mean, talking about sales reductions of 70 to 80% in recreation services, accommodation and food and so on, passenger transport. Whereas other sectors were less badly hit. Less consumer-facing services and essential services were not that badly hit. They did have quite substantial reductions in sales, but nothing like as bad as the other sectors. And then if you look at the composition of working hours, then again, you see a diverse picture. In those sectors which were most hit by COVID in terms of sales, you also see very high furlough rates. People are essentially being told to go home and not to do any work for the business. But you also see quite a large number of individuals being asked to work from home rather than work in the workplace. So these are things that we've got to factor in. And although this is a picture from May 2020, if we look at the picture through time, then we see that furlough was about a third of the workforce back in May 2020. It's declined progressively since then, and the furlough scheme is due to wrap up soon. But working from home has persisted, and so we see that that still enduring at around about 30%. So the key findings that we've got in this presentation are that total factor productivity as a result of all these changes has fallen by about 2% by 2021 Q4. And this is made up of two components, which I'm going to examine in more detail. The first is that within firms, that is just looking at how productive firms have been, we see that because of the increase in costs, primarily, there's been a large decrease in total factor productivity of -3%. But that's offset by the increase in productivity between firms, mostly because the really low productivity firms have dropped out of the calculation. So by a batting average, it means that the average has risen because the low ones are no longer in the calculation. And this is partly down to the fact that some of these firms have stopped producing output at certain points in time, and others have just shrunk more quickly. Perhaps they're more badly managed. Now, in the medium term, when we take into account the reduction in research and development and the diversion of management time to cope with COVID, then probably the total effects are going to be about -1%. So this is rather ominous for the long run productivity growth, which is already low, but may have now turned negative. So let's dig into the details in a bit more, in more detail. And I should say, by the way, that I'm going to concentrate on the UK, given the time. And so we're going to look at data mostly from the Decision Maker Panel, which is a survey of UK businesses conducted online every month. And we're gathering information about the impact of COVID on variables like sales, employment, hours worked, etc. And the kind of question we're asking is, relative to what would otherwise have happened, what's your best estimate for the impact of COVID on, for example, sales in your business? And we ask them to give us answers over a number of quarters ahead. And if we look at the kind of data that we then get from that, we can see that unit costs have increased, employment has decreased a bit, but not as much as sales. So that perhaps reflects the impact of furlough. But hours worked has fallen a lot more. So hours worked is a lot lower than sales. So using this data, we can then start to calculate the effects of labor productivity and total factor productivity. So here's some calculations, first of all, about the effects that COVID had within the firm. And what we've got here are two measures of productivity, labor productivity and total factor productivity, indicating the impacts of various components on the productivity calculation. So the reduction in labor hours shows an increase in productivity as a result of that, because there are fewer hours being worked, but a certain amount of output being divided by that lower number. But at the same time, as the labor inputs have declined, so have real sales, and that reduces the amount of output that we're recording, and there are additional costs as well. So combining the effects of the costs and the sales which have declined and the labor inputs that have declined, the net effect given by the black line with dots is a slight decline, just a few percent. But that's quite persistent, and that stays for some time. If you then look at the total factor productivity in the right-hand graph, what you see is that the magnitude of the total change, the black line with the dots, has actually become a lot larger, and mostly that's down to the fact that the labor input is weighted to contribute less, and capital inputs are also weighted in this calculation, but capital inputs don't change much. So the net effect in total factor productivity terms is larger than the labor productivity terms. So this is what's going on within the firms in the short term. And we'd probably want to think in terms of medium-term impacts for the effects of R&D investment declining and average amount of time that managers are spending just dealing with COVID having further negative effects on those calculations. So these are further negative impacts on productivity. Now, what about between firms? Well, again, we have to look at the different sectors and the firms that are in them. And what we see here is that the low productivity firms were much more impacted by COVID than the high productivity firms. So on this chart, the left-hand side of the scale shows low productivity firms based on their 2017 to 2019 averages, and the vertical axis shows the impact on the hours worked, and the blue dots show that low productivity firms over on the left-hand side had much larger reductions in hours worked than firms that were higher productivity towards the right-hand side. And if we want to know which firms were involved, well, it's recreation services and accommodation and food which were most impacted negatively, and firms and sectors like real estate, financial insurance, info and communications, etc., that were least affected. So this is indicating that the COVID impact was much harder on the low productivity firms. Now, if we were to work out what those effects were on labor productivity and TFP, then what we see is that the decline in hours combines with a slightly smaller decline in output to lead to a labor productivity boom, given by, again, the black line with dots, and a slight boom in total factor productivity, but to a lower extent. So adding up those between firm and within firm effects, we can then work out the total. And on labor productivity terms, we see that boom in labor productivity initially in 2020 Q2, which eventually turns negative towards the end of 2021. This is at least based on the expectations of the firms in terms of what output they expect and how many hours they expect. And looking at the right-hand graph, you see that total factor productivity is consistently negative, although the extent of the negativity kind of diminishes as we look further out. So in summary, the impact of COVID on production is not the usual Schumpeterian process of creative destruction, a cycle that we've seen for centuries, but it's rather an indication that there's been destruction of low productivity industries like accommodation and food and recreational services, and not really much substantial creation in other industries, at least in the short run. This might change in the medium term, but at least looking out to 2021 Q4, there doesn't seem to be that Schumpeterian process at work. So overall, the impact on productivity is -2% out to 2021 Q4. And this is made up of the negative contribution within firms and the positive contribution between firms. So the negative contribution within firms is simply down to the fact that they've had lower sales, higher costs, and these have had more of an effect than the lower hours that have been worked. Between firms, the low productivity firms are generally in low wage industries, and they've shrunk much faster than other firms and adapted a lot less well to COVID. So the batting average for TFP is slightly improved by those low productivity firms being dropped out of the calculation or given a lower weight. In the medium term, we think it's going to impact productivity by about -1%. So this is a pretty ominous view for TFP growth, but I'm hoping that John and Nick and Rebecca will give us some positive views that will show us that there's a bright side to the future, not just a dark side. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Paul. That nicely set the tone. And so thanks, and that's super interesting talk and packed with data-driven insights. So next up, we have Professor Nick Bloom. Nick is a professor of economics at Stanford University. As many of you know, Nick is a prolific author of many studies measuring and explaining management practices, as well as how this determines firm and national performance. So over past years, Nick has been researching the much talked about hybrid work and remote working. And so we're delighted to have him to share with us his insights from this stream of work. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Cher. Yeah, very happy. This is a great lineup, by the way. It's fantastic. It's lovely to have the four. I'm interested to hear what Rebecca and John are going to say. Hopefully it's consistent. So I'll share my screen. So as Paul mentioned, I'm going to talk about working from home. I'm going to focus slightly more on the US because I know Paul was talking a bit more about the UK, but it's joint work with Paul and Shivani at Nottingham and Jose Barrero and Steve Davis in Chicago. So I'm going to talk for about the first 5-6 minutes on trends in working from home, and then some of the economic implications that might have looking ahead. So here's a graph of days working from home. It's one measure of how intensive working from home is. It's data for the US. So I've been running in the US with Jose and Steve Davis right back since basically the beginning of the pandemic, a survey of around 5,000 Americans a month. We've done a very similar thing with Paul and Shivani in the UK. The numbers look actually very similar. We started a bit later, so that's why I'm just going to show you the US data. And this is the percentage of full paid work days from home. So why do we focus on a full paid day, since many people work at home in the mornings and the evenings? The reason basically is this affects commute and office space. So on the left, we can see pre-pandemic, that's about 5%. So before the pandemic, effectively, there was very little full days work from home. You know, a few people did here or there, but it was only 5% of days, so it's really not a big deal. During the pandemic, this thing exploded to around 50% of days. And you can think about it as being explained this way. Basically, half of the US, Canadian, UK, much of Northern European workforces cannot work from home. So they're folks in like frontline retail, manufacturing, a lot of healthcare, a lot of education. And they have basically had to come in to, the business premises or, on site, or they've had, they struggle basically throughout the pandemic. Those folks have not worked from home, and they will not work from home post-pandemic. The other half of people who typically are university graduates, tend to be much more professionals, managers, etc., higher earning, have worked from home. Probably pretty much everyone listening is working from home. And folks, people like us basically have worked from home pretty much full-time during the pandemic. It's gone up and down with waves. The question is what's going to happen post-pandemic. So this number, you can get it from 3 different ways. One is you can survey individuals. We just ask them what their employer has told them. Secondly, we have a survey in the UK, the DMP, Paul mentioned, in the US, of around about 3,000 firms a month. And then thirdly, throughout the pandemic, I've been talking to a lot of companies and organizations on working from home. Oddly enough, as Cher mentioned, I've long worked on it. It was a kind of pretty unusual backwater topic until March 2020, and then it exploded. But I've probably talked to, 100, 200 organizations. Like I talked to 3 or 4 this week about this, and it's pretty much unanimous in terms of from the survey data and organizations that for employees like us that are currently working from home, post-pandemic, it's going to go hybrid. So a typical thing is firms, like I'll show in a minute, but, you know, Google, Apple, Amazon, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, tons of companies have announced that for employees, managers, professionals that were previously working from home, you're going to say, come in 3 days a week, work from home 2 days a week. Or, you know, the UK civil service, I think, is doing 2-3. So for half of employees, they're going to come in roughly half the time and work from home the other half. And for the other half, lower paid, lower skilled, typically, they're going to remain at home. And so that's why post-pandemic, we see go to 25%. So why is hybrid dominated? Hybrid is just totally dominant at this point. You know, there's virtually no one is trying to get their employees back to the office full time. A couple of firms, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, tried early, have more or less given up, apparently, from internal rumors. It's more or less impossible to get graduate employees back full time. So why has everyone gone to hybrid? Well, hybrid kind of combines the best of both worlds. So if you think of it like what Apple is doing, they're saying, look, people should come in Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. We're going to have 3 days a week. Well, we're going to be very office focused, lots of meetings, lots of client events, all the training. You know, it's going to help create with creativity or help maintain office culture. Then the other 2 days a week, you're going to work from home, which is a big upside because it's quiet. You know, I've just heard so many stories and anecdotes about noise in the office, of which my favorite was the person that complained that the person at the desk next to them tries to clip their toenails under the desk with the toenail clipper in the office, and so, you know, can imagine it's disgusting. And they say it's like really distracting. There's all kinds of horrible office stories about noise and people crying and shouting, etc. So the home is quieter, and you see in, for example, randomized controlled trials, people are more efficient per minute at home. And also important, it saves on commute. So the average Brit or the average American commutes about an hour a day, half an hour each way. In the survey data, it looks like for people that don't commute, they spend about half the saved time working on their primary job and half as leisure. So if you're an employer, if you save people 2 hours of commute a day, they work an hour extra for you on average. And of course, they take an hour extra of leisure. So both sides are better off. So that's why hybrid is dominated. And if you watch the news, you know, it's completely dominant in the media. Loads and loads of companies are announcing it. So, you know, one big reason for this is, at this point, honestly, it's very hard to do much else. So here's a survey question. We said, if my employer announced all employees must return to the work site 5+ days a week on August 1st, we asked this in July, I would, and, you know, 57% would return, but over 40% said they'd basically return and look for another job or quit on the spot. So it's becoming basically impossible for, you know, graduates in sectors that are hard to hire to get people back 5 days a week. So, and no one I talk to is doing that, or every firm I talk to is basically going hybrid. So before I talk about long run economic implications, I want to tell a story that links very closely to the management data that Rebecca and John are going to talk about, which is on the top right is Marissa Mayer. So Marissa Mayer was the CEO of Yahoo from 2012 to 2017. She had a pretty good tenure. She's now, you know, running a successful startup. She was in the news, most of all, actually, in 2013 when she banned working from home, and it leaked out the company. It was all over the media. There was a big storm, and it wasn't great for Marissa Mayer at the time. I actually interviewed her about a year ago. I spent about an hour talking to her and asked her what happened, and it's tightly connected to management practices. So she said, look, if you have employees, you can manage them in two ways. You can either manage them based on outputs. So you can say, look, I'm going to, you know, if I was working for Cher could say to me, Nick, I'm going to evaluate you based on, you know, maybe teaching, research, service for the department, or I'm in a company, sales, you know, reports, written contracts, whatever, my deliverables. And with that, it's very easy to have people work from home, say 2-3 days a week, because you don't really watch what they're doing. You basically look what they do. And so people can work from home and they can be flexible about it and they can remain efficient. She said the problem was when she took over Yahoo in 2012, that kind of performance management system wasn't in place. And so instead you have to use what she called input-based management, which is in the office, it's desk watching. So is somebody physically there typing away, you know, working at their desk. But if they're working from home, you can't see them. So what can you do? Well, either you don't really manage them, which is pretty awful, or even worse, actually, you install this horrible, creepy surveillance software, which these are screenshots where, you know, like I have a camera on Paul, watching his Paul actually paying attention. Is he at his desk? And I screenshot what he's doing. So even if he's sitting at his desk, I can see if he's playing online computer games. So these kind of things are awful. And the bottom line is, in order to make working from home work, you need good output or HR performance management systems. And in the data, so here's UK data from the ONS. I saw Gaganin's on the call, who, I know Rebecca's going to talk about this. John, I think, is going to talk about this. This is UK data. We just see that better managed firms are more likely to work from home. We see this in Japan. There's some kind of, related evidence in Italy and from World Bank stuff. Basically, better managed firms are much more likely to work from home because I think it works better and they've been able to perform better. So what about economic implications? I end for the kind of last 5 minutes and some other implications. So one is productivity. So as Paul mentioned, productivity growth is not great, and it's actually been on a long run downward trend. Here's easy data to pull. It's for the US. It's output per hour growth. You can see it's kind of trending down. In the 1950s, it was about growing around 4% a year. It's now growing at 1% a year. That's true for 30 OECD countries, including the UK. So this is a broad issue. I was out in Singapore just before the lockdown, and they were complaining bitterly about slowing productivity growth. They're not even in here. So there's it's a very broad issue. John, with myself, Mike Webb, and Chad Jones, have a paper arguing the reason productivity has been on a long decline is it's just harder and harder to come up with new ideas. So you just see in the data there's more and more expenditure on R&D, and we're having slowing growth rates. And in some ways there's nothing wrong with that. Here's UK data going back for a very long way. If we look at the long run trend of UK productivity growth, it was 0.1% by Madison's data up until about 1750. So productivity was hardly growing. Income roughly doubled from 1,000 to over 750 years. Then the Industrial Revolution starts. Productivity growth in the UK starts to rise, as in the US, I guess, if you'd had the data, up to around 2% at the peak in the 50s, and then it's been falling back again. So productivity growth now falling back down is not so terrible compared to the long run of history. It's just I wouldn't expect going forwards we're going to have anything like we've had over the last 30 to 50 years. I put this up because it links to what Paul said. I've had a number of people saying, oh, the pandemic's changed everything. We're going to see a new normal, working from home, automation, blah, 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 has changed productivity growth. Maybe, but I'm not very optimistic given that this trend has only changed course twice in the last 250 years. So as Paul said, the pandemic impact looks like it's been negative. One of the few bright lights is maybe working from home. That is correct, but our estimates and the stuff we've looked at with Paul and Siobhan in the UK suggest sure working from home may increase productivity, but it just doesn't look a big amount. It looks like, I don't know, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5%. So fine, that's definitely helpful. As with Paul said, I'm not very optimistic that's going to overweigh the enormous productivity damage of social distancing, of unused capacity, from a lot of very necessary, and I'm totally in favor of them, important protocols to stop the spread of pandemic, but nevertheless damaging for productivity. So I personally think the pandemic net is not going to reverse this trend, and productivity will remain pretty sluggish by recent standards, but maybe high by longer run standards post-pandemic. One other issue is inequality. So turns out, not surprisingly, people really like hybrid working. So we asked people, how would you value the ability to work from home 2-3 days a week? The average response is it's equivalent to about a 7 to 8% pay increase. That's actually very consistent with data from Mass and Pillay pre-pandemic from randomized control trials. So, I could ask, everyone could self-reflect, but personally, I definitely like the thought of working from home 2-3 days a week. It also turns out, if you look at who's going to get this nice perk, it's strongly skewed towards high earners. So these black circles here are how many days post-pandemic people want to work from home by income. It's basically flat. Everyone effectively post-pandemic on average wants to work from home about 2 to 3 days a week. This is what they say they're going to get, and you can see it's very, very strongly upward sloping. So, wealthy folks, people above $200,000 or particularly $100,000, in the UK, divide that by what, roughly, that's slightly less than a half, but 60, maybe £100,000 a year are roughly going to get what they want. And people below that, lower income people are not. It's not an income effect, but it shows in terms of welfare post-pandemic, working from home, the fact that only half of people get it is going to increase welfare inequality, kind of utility inequality. finally, I end on technical change. One bright spot is this is data from the US Patent and Trademark Office. It's with Yulia Zakova and Steve Davis. We just look at the number of new patents that mentions work from home, remote work. Not surprisingly, it's rapidly growing. You know, the pandemic has generated a huge incentive for people to improve on work from home technology. I've been working on working from home for almost 20 years. And even looking back, it has changed a lot. So here are two sets of photos I took in 2010. They maybe look kind of recent. You know, they look like, if you look at them, you think, that could be now. But there's two enormous differences versus 2010 that already are a big deal for us. One is there was no, Zoom wasn't really widespread. People, when they conference call back then, used the telephone. Skype only was founded in 2003, and Zoom was, I think, 2010 or 11. So video conference calls like this, like we're using exactly now, are a relatively recent innovation that obviously make it way more effective to work from home. The other thing is the cloud and stuff like Dropbox to file share. So back in 2010, if you're working with someone, you'd phone them up on a conference call on the phone, and then you'd send files over by email. So it's kind of painful. If you go back, I've interviewed people that worked from home in the 80s, and they said it was truly awful. It was like, you'd have to drive to the office to pick up stacks of paper, and there was no home computers, etc. So, to close, working from home is great. It's definitely not perfect, but the technology around it, this is, a classic example of directed technical change, is getting a lot better. And with that, we have a website, there's the DMP, we have this WFHresearch website as well. I will stop and pass back to the group.
Thanks so much, Nick. Brilliant. Thanks for the very stimulating talk on this very timely issue, and it's really something all the organizations are grappling with. And so just a reminder, if you joined us later, I'd like to encourage everyone to post any thoughts or any questions you may have in the meeting chat below. Even though we won't be answering the questions right now, our panelists will come back and answer those in our Q&A session at the end. Okay, so next up we have Professor John Van Reenen. John is the Ronald Coates Professor and the London School of Economics, and also the Gordon Billett Professor of Management and Economics at the MIT. Many of you know John is the director of the new ESRC program on innovation and diffusion, and his research has reflected that focus on the causes and the consequences of innovation. So John has received numerous awards for his services to economics and public policy making. I won't go through all these, otherwise we'll be here all day long. So over to you, John, to talk to us about the interplay between management and new technologies.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Cher, for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be able to come and share a few thoughts here. I hope you can see my my slides. Is that okay, Cher? Can you see them? Yeah, I'm assuming silence means yes.
Yes, yes.
So I'll push on. Okay, so it's going to pick up many of the themes which the first two speakers have talked about. I'm going to take a little bit more of a kind of a macro approach to thinking about some of these questions. If I can just move my slides on. Here we go. So I made this argument with Anna Valero, who's the co-director of POID, and I think my basic argument is that to recover from the crisis, we need to get back to sustainable productivity growth, as we've seen, and as both Nick and Paul have said, this was a problem even before COVID. And I think what COVID has done is, in some sense, to kind of starkly reveal existing economic and political weaknesses we have in the UK and broadly across those different countries. So, looking back at history, in order to get to that sustainable productivity growth, we need to think very hard about technological progress, because that's at the heart of the growth. And in order to do that, we need both technology, but I'm going to argue also, as you might expect, we also need good management too. In terms of COVID specifically, from a theoretical point of view, it has this very ambiguous effects on technology adoption. And, I'm going to actually show some evidence, I think, that the pandemic has actually stimulated some greater diffusion of new technologies. I mean, it's ambiguous in theory, but in practice, there seems to be evidence that that's had, which is a kind of a useful thing. But overall, I guess I'm with Paul here that in terms of the long run, there's probably a negative hit from COVID. So in terms of dealing with that and these long-term problems, we have to think of a long-term growth plan to try and deal with the problems we face. So I'm going to talk about the challenge, understanding growth, COVID's impact, and then give you some ideas which I think should go into a proper growth plan for the UK and broadly. Okay, so we've seen this before. This is GDP growth in the UK. So during the global financial crisis, we were all saying this is the worst crisis that we've lived through in our lives, but unfortunately that wasn't true. And the hit we took in COVID has been much worse. So the bounce back, at least initially, seems to be slightly stronger, but that hit is absolutely enormous in terms of our GDP. And as Nick and Paul said, this is a long run problem. So if you look at TFP growth on the left, this is kind of numbers in the US, you can see that TFP growth after the Second World War during the golden years was pretty good, slowed down after the oil crisis. Then, and this is one thing I think is worth thinking about and picking up, there was a period in the US for about 10 years where we had a kind of productivity miracle, a productivity explosion. And that was very much in the back of technology, like information and communication technology and the internet. But, as we know from the mid-2000s, things have been pretty bad, very low TFP growth. And, in the Eurozone, more generally, we've also seen actually a gradual fall of TFP. Actually, TFP growth in the main European countries was superior to the US up until the mid-90s, but then there wasn't the same productivity boom with ICT in the mid-90s and mid-2000s, and since the kind of mid-2000s, things have been even worse in Europe than they have been in the US. Now, what about the UK? Well, this looks at labour productivity, but this is the disaster picture we're unfortunately too familiar with. So if for the period, the 30 years prior to the global financial crisis, the UK's GDP per hour was actually doing pretty well. It was actually exceeding its long-run trends and catching up with continental Europe and the US to some extent. But since the global financial crisis, has been a real disaster. So if you look at where we are now compared to where we were on the financial crisis, we're something like 30% lower than where we might have expected, and that's actually worse than most other advanced countries. So, the UK was bad before and, has a serious problem during COVID too. So how can we understand growth, particularly productivity growth, and what can we, do about it? Well, at a broad level, there's kind of three factors. So one is, I think for advanced countries like the UK, frontier growth is really important. There are areas where, healthcare, but, vaccine development, biotech, some parts of software like AI, where the UK is near the frontier and we have opportunities to push the frontier forward. But there's still a lot of room for improvement without frontier growth. Firstly, by the faster diffusion of technology, such as the adoption of best practices, I would argue both management practices and also more kind of traditional hard technologies. But secondly, there's lots of opportunities to improve productivity by reducing what economists call misallocation. In other words, getting more market share, more output towards the more productive firms. That aspect which Paul emphasized, which seems to be not working very well in the pandemic period. But policies need to address all those three type of areas, and all those three ways of stimulating productivity growth can be beneficial and also, of course, increase wages. So what are the two fundamental sources? I think one is technology and the other is management practices. And I think that the technology story is easier to convince people of. If you think about as Nick showed you on the long view, there was the first industrial revolution in the UK at the end of the 18th century in the back of steam power. We had the second industrial revolution during that amazing year in 1879, where we had those innovations in luminosity from Edison, from mobility from Carl Benz, and from communication technology by David Hughes, and that powered a lot of productivity growth at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. And then in the kind of that mid-90s to mid-2000s period, we also had the digital revolution, which you know, I was on the back of the internet, very fast falls of quality adjusted prices of computers. And many people think we're now living through a potential fourth industrial revolution around AI, big data, different types of health and gene therapies, maybe robotics. So that's, I think, you know, clearly technology matters a lot, but you know, I think many of the people who are presenting, I think management is also very important. So, you know, Nick and I, you know, over probably 20 years ago, started working on trying to quantify management practices and different dimensions in a more rigorous way, going and measuring things like how firms collect data, how they use that to set goals and targets, how they use that to manage people, you know, involving workers, continuous improvement, for example. And that data, if you're interested in, is in the World Management Survey. It covers 34 countries, and it gives a measure of the management quality in different firms around the world, around 34 to 40 firms. If you look at the scores of those kind of management quality measures, they line up pretty well with productivity. So, you know, you see at the kind of top, the kind of leading countries like the US, Japan, and Germany. The UK is doing, you know, relatively well. It's not the Premier League, but it's, you know, knocking on the door of that, if you like, with other Western European countries. And as you go down, you get to Southern European countries, emerging economies like Brazil and India, and poorer Latin American countries at the bottom, and African countries. So that very much looks like the kind of productivity distribution. But more interesting, I think, to me, is how that varies within countries. So if you use some of the variance, which is massive, within every country, you can see that lines up actually pretty well with firm performance. So this is from the US data, but of course we've done other work on the UK with Paul and Rebecca and the MOPS team. But what we find here is that there's a very strong relationship between firms which have better management practices and the productivity, but also the profits, their growth, their innovation, and their export status. So, you know, management does seem to really matter at the micro level. And it also matters in terms of understanding those macro level differences. So if you take these firm level differences and try and combine these with the impact on productivity from this type of evidence and other kind of randomized control trial evidence, you can try and work out what the overall effect is on TFP differences. These gray lines give you the TFP differences across countries, normalized at 100 to be the US. So like the UK is about 15% lower than the US is. And these orange lines tell you how much of that can be accounted for by management. So you can see on average, it's about 30%. But for a country like the UK, and for most, you know, relatively advanced countries, management is really important, explaining something like half of all the TFP differences across these more advanced countries. So it shows you the possibility of management to really make a difference. But you think one step further than that. So both technology and management matter, but they also interact really importantly. So one of the things I think we've learned from looking at the history of technology is that when you look at the impact of new technologies like the electricity that I mentioned earlier on, Paul David, for example, showed that it took many decades between the invention of electricity and it moving the dial on productivity. It took a managerial reorganization to move to the kind of factory system where factories were open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, using a production line, which could use electricity in a way more effectively. So it's the combination of the new technology which gives the opportunity with reorganizing workplaces through better management, which gives us our productivity benefits. And we saw that very clearly, actually, analysis of looking at the reasons for this IT boom and why it was stronger in the US than it was in Europe was very closely related to the different management practices, especially around people management practices, hiring, firing, and promoting. So work that I've done with Nick and other authors has shown this complementarity that you need both good technology and good management if you really want to improve productivity. And I think when we think about artificial intelligence and, you know, why is it that AI and other new technologies of the fourth industrial revolution haven't translated through to productivity in the way we should have, part of what we need is this kind of experimentation and learning with management in order to get those productivity increases. And, you know, I think those will come, but they'll only come slowly over time as we make these investments in management to make the change. Another way of saying this is that organizations can waste a lot of money on spending on technology without much effect on productivity. I spent a year working in the National Health Service and, you know, there was a very bad experience with spending a lot on IT with very disappointing returns. So what about COVID? So, you know, there's many ways in which COVID, you could say, was a blocker of technical change. So, less incentive to adopt because of lower demand and more uncertainty, less ability to adopt because firms face financial constraints of distractions and managerial time, which Nick has shown some evidence of that. On the other hand, there are ways in which there could be enablers of technology. I put up Newton here, of course, because people often say, Newton had his greatest ideas during the Great Plague, when he could actually sit and innovate. But we could think about several methods. So one is like investment in online platforms, so to enable consumers to buy things online, for workers to work from home. That has stimulated a lot of investments in new digital platforms. There's going to be a lot more automation. When you don't have workers, you have to invest in automation. That's also increased. And more generally, there's been more experimentation. I mean, the one way to think about this is that there's lower opportunity costs of doing things differently and experimenting in different ways. And when that happens, often that type of organizational innovation can actually lead to productivity changes. So there's lots of examples of that and anecdotes of that we've seen during the crisis, and some of those will actually lead to productivity benefits from that kind of technological innovation over time. But there's some evidence from this. I put up some work here by Ana Valero, who has been working with the CBI, and in their surveys of many firms, they've shown that there has been a kind of big increase in the investment in digital technologies, digital capabilities, and to some extent the management practices over the course of the pandemic. This is 2020 data, and this is very much up on kind of pre-crisis trends. So when you ask firms why they've made these investments, overwhelmingly say that this is going to be prompted by the kind of pressure of the pandemic. So there have been some examples of where this has been successful, and these type of these kind of investments and diffusion will lead to some productivity increases. But overall, I think, like I guess Paul and Nick have been arguing, that this is overall there's likely to be a depressing effect on productivity. I think there is a sense in which there's likely to be a decline of research and development, distraction of managerial time. There's some evidence from various surveys of innovation. So I think that although there are some maybe short-run benefits in terms of adopting new technology, in the long run, this actually is going to be more of a drag on productivity than other factors. So I think that reinforces the need to think, thinking about a kind of joined-up growth plan for the UK, and more broadly, as I've argued in work in the US and in Europe, we need a kind of new Marshall Plan for growth. And I think there's three elements to that. One is institutional changes. I think one of the biggest problems we have in the UK is policy attention deficit disorder, which I argued in the LSE Growth Commission. So I think there are many ways in which we need to reform institutions to actually use expertise and take a longer run view, and to, in order to deal with the problems of inadequate investments in human capital and R&D and infrastructure, we need really to think about institutions which will help shield some decision makers from short-run political pressures. In the short run, we need a balance between withdrawing many schemes to have protection, but also to enable reallocation. And in the long run, we need a variety of policies. So some are structural, like competition, trade, skills policies, tax reforms, and some are direct, such as giving managerial information and training, which Rebecca's going to talk about. But most importantly, we need to use evidence and use experimentation. So, in some work with Nick, Heidi Williams, Raphael Assad, and others, we've tried to develop policy toolkits, which you could use to actually assess the evidence to put into a growth plan. So I very much believe that, having a growth plan built around these things, binding them together, maybe around the mission of climate change, is the way to kind of get us out of the hole that we're currently in. Anyway, if you're interested, you can look at the Managing Policy Toolkit, but I'm out of time, and thanks very much, and over to Rebecca.
Perfect. Thanks so much, John. Very useful insights around the technologies and management practices, and for highlighting the role of experimentation and that whole sort of learning by doing in this process as well. Finally, we have our last panelist, Rebecca. Rebecca Riley is a professor of practicing economics and King's Business School at King's College London. Many of you know Rebecca is the director of the UK Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, ESCO, and also she's a co-investigator of the newly created Productivity Institute. Rebecca leads the ESRC project to conduct this large-scale management and expectation survey that you will hear about, and that is in collaboration with ONS. And the floor is yours, Rebecca.
Thank you, Cher, and thanks very much for inviting me to this. So I'm going to talk a bit about some new evidence on UK businesses from some new data that we've collected both during the pandemic and before the pandemic. And as Cher mentioned, this is part of a ESRC and UKRI funded project. The project's called Understanding and Explaining Management Practices to Promote Higher Productivity in UK Businesses. And it's carried out with ESCO and the Office for National Statistics, and also involves the other speakers here today who are all involved in this project. And in this work, we're collecting and analyzing data to understand the links between management and performance. For example, does management help businesses deal with uncertainty? Does it change the way they respond to shocks like COVID and Brexit? That's not the topic of that's not what I'm going to talk about today. We have some early analytical results that the ONS put together and presented in May, where they showed that better managed, I think Nick had some of this on his slides as well, better managed firms in the UK were more likely to adopt home working during the pandemic and also move to online sales. So, you know, if management practices are so important for firms and in their performance and managing their performance, how can we actually help firms to improve these practices, and how can we make sure this technology diffuses? So we go back to some of the things that John was talking about. So what I'm going to do now in the next 10 minutes or so is just to illustrate some of the barriers to actually helping firms improve their management practices. So how do I, there we go. Okay, so I'll start with the data that we collected in 2017. We collected data on management practices very much in the way that John was talking about, that they've done with the World Management Survey and the MOPS. So it's comparable to the studies that have been done internationally. And we also collected information on businesses' expectations. We did this using some sampling frames from already existing surveys in the UK so that we could link data and carry out this analysis of the links between the practices and performances. And we have, you know, these 4 categories of management practices that are standard in these studies, including sort of whether businesses engage in continuous improvement, how they, you know, what their use of KPIs is, what their use of targets is, and also very much how they manage their workforce. And we were able to look at both these behaviors in services sector and manufacturing, which I think is a relatively novel thing. Anyway, we started with the data back in 2017, and that was referring to what businesses were doing in the UK in 2016. And here's some charts from a publication from that analysis, which shows, you know, that shows you sort of the decile of management score along the x-axis, and then it shows you how that maps to gross value added and how it maps to gross operating surplus or profits. And you see the picture that we've come to see lots of other places, that there is a correlation between this measure of management practices and business performance. And, you know, I think in this paper, this was early work with Jenny Vyas at the ONS and Gagan and Owano at ONS at the time. You know, they ran some regressions just to sort of control for other factors that might influence performance. And they also found very much the usual result that, you know, there's a very strong correlation between this indicator and labor productivity. So for example, they find if you move up a decile or if you move up 0.1 on the management practices score, which is recorded between 0 and 1. So you move 0.1 up this number, you improve your labor productivity by 10%. And this is controlling for lots of other things. So that's massive. You know, the difference between the 25th percentile and the median of management practices leads to a labor productivity increase of about 20% or something like that. So very, very big effects. So in this project, what we wanted to do is we wanted to develop some data that would enable us to look at this in a little bit more detail. And really the question was, if management practices lead to these fantastic improvements in performance, why isn't everybody doing this? So the questions are, what are the barriers to adopting these better practices? Or is it the case, for example, that management practices affect firm performance through their complementarities with all sorts of other things, like what John just talked about, new technologies, etc., or help you better adapt to changing circumstances? Or is it that the correlation partially reflects that better managed firms are more productive, but more productive firms also adopt better management practices? So is there a bit of a circular thing going on? So to answer these types of questions, we wanted to develop longitudinal survey data on these things. So what we've done is we've gone out and repeated this survey from 2017. In 2020, we had to make some changes because we weren't expecting COVID to happen. So we changed the format of the survey, but we were able to collect information on business practices in 2019, right before the pandemic hit, and then also in 2020 as it was all happening. And what we've done is we have also made sure that there's a representative cross-section over time, but also we've had a booster survey to ensure that we've got enough firms that are in a panel, longitudinal data over time. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do. And just to show you, again, from the 20, if we think about who actually adopts these management practices and go look at what we had from the 2017 survey, we know that the size of the firm matters for adoption, whether they're foreign owned, whether they're family owned or not. These types of things matter for who actually adopts these structured management practices. This is not really what I want to focus on, but just say that these results that we see in lots of other countries are also evident in the data we're looking at. So from the recent survey, which was carried out with ONS as well, and with Jakob Schneebacher and Anna Ardenas Badia and Zahir Islam, they did some initial analysis of the survey that concluded in February 21. They've been quality assuring the data here in the spring, and over the summer have been producing some initial analysis. And what has come out of that exercise, looking at the 2017 data compared to the 2020 data, we're seeing that the mean management score has been shifting to the right. So firms have been improving their management practices. The distribution is moving along to the right on these charts. And we've got that for the whole sample on the left, but also for the linked sample to deal with any issues in sample selection. So that's reassuring. And as I say, and it actually matches also what John was highlighting from Anna Valero's survey, that they're finding that businesses were improving their management practices in the pandemic. So let's move on from that and go back to that question about how can we actually help firms to adopt better management practices. So I want to highlight another question we asked in this survey. We said to firms, look, thank you for filling out this survey. Would you like to know what your management practices score actually was? And so that allowed us to get back to firms and show them what their performance looked like. And about 40% of firms were interested in this. And we followed up with this group. The ONS sent feedback to this group. It also then directed them to a website that we had constructed specifically for firms to go and look at their scores, to look at how they compare to other similar businesses. Some of the firms that wanted feedback actually went and looked at this. And then we also provided an opportunity for them to participate in a mentoring offer, which we did in collaboration with Be the Business. So what I'm going to show you now is who these firms were who actually wanted to engage with this information. So sorry about the regressions, but so basically this is just a regression of who wanted this feedback, on some sort of, this was feedback in the 2019 survey, who wanted this feedback and some basic characteristics that describe them in 2019. And what we see is that, in the top row, the management score, better managed firms were more likely to want to have feedback. We also see something about size, different ownership. Domestically owned firms were more interested in feedback, actually. But what we also see, bottom right-hand corner, columns 4 and 5, is that the least productive firms were less likely to want to engage with feedback. So, we're seeing this situation where the firms who might benefit most from engaging and getting involved and understanding their score and maybe taking up an offer to do more training are least interested in actually engaging with this. We also looked at the change in management practices between 2019 and 2020. We've also looked at 2016 to 2019. And what we find then is that those firms who improved their management scores during the pandemic were those firms who were more likely to want to have feedback. And as I've just described on the previous slides, those were generally more productive firms and firms who already had higher management scores. So the first thing you see in this table is, and this is the change in the management score between 2019 and 2020 in the UK businesses, or it's Great Britain actually. On the first line, you'll see a negative correlation with the existing management score. And all that says is that there's quite a sort of, this is a slow moving variable, okay? So what my management practices today are 90% determined by what I did last year. So there's persistence in management practices. When we look at this over a 3-year period, there's much less persistence, but I'm just showing you now the results here during the pandemic. Then you see a lot of things that are not statistically significant as indicated by a lack of stars. But what you see at the bottom as well is that if you requested feedback, you were more likely to increase your management practices, okay? So there is this correlation. It's not a huge number. So if you engage with feedback, you probably increased, you were more likely, you change your management practices by 0.1, and that leads to a 1% increase in your productivity, say. So, but this is just a first cut, and I think if you look over the longer term, this effect perhaps doubles or something like that. So those regressions were about people or companies who had responded to our survey, which is the gray bar, the population of firms who had responded. And as I said, about 40%, 39%, actually requested feedback. So those regressions were actually about that first layer of engaging with the evidence. If we then go to the firms that actually went and looked at the evidence, that's only 30% of those who requested feedback went to look at the evidence. And of those, only 3% actually wanted to take up any training. So there's a huge, this chart was compiled by Sarah Islam and Jakob Sneebacher, and they called this the leaky pipeline. So basically there's huge attrition, and I want to show you the characteristics of the firms as we go through these different layers. So just as we saw that, firms who wanted feedback tended to be better managed in the first place and tended to be higher productivity in the first place, so arguably needed to engage less, we see the same pattern as we move from those who wanted feedback in the gray bar to those who actually wanted feedback but then didn't bother to engage with it, to those, and it gets darker blue as we go through this, to those actually visited the website, and to those who actually then went on and took up a training offer. So we see that there is this selection into engaging as we go through this process. And this is evident on all of these different management indicators, except for the KPIs, say, in the last one. But generally, there's a clear trend here. And moreover, this pattern holds within industry groups, and it holds within employment size bands, so it's nothing to do with these factors, and it also holds within regions of the UK. So it's pretty persistent, this pattern. So just to sum up, I wanted to just, say with these new survey data, what we're finding is that, this evidence points to some barriers in getting firms to engage with better management, and taking up offers to improve management. That's relevant, of course. The government has put in place various programs it's hoping businesses will engage with to both adopt digital technologies, but also to improve their management. It also raises questions about, who are we actually helping? I mean, in the UK, we have a big, what's been described as a fat tail of low productivity, low performing businesses. And these are the ones who are least likely to engage with these programs. So there's questions here being raised about how do we target these policies? When we evaluate these policies, there's issues of dead weight here. These firms might have been sorting themselves out in the first place anyway. And I think that was the sum of what I wanted to say.